Anatoly Timofeyevich, our upcoming lecture will focus on a truly important and unique topic. We'll be talking about the turning point in history, the collapse of the Great World Empire and the birth of the political map of the world that we all grow up with from childhood. It's hard for us to even imagine that, once, there was a vast, unified empire on this planet, ruled from a single center, with a single political and religious worldview. An empire that didn't have many of the things we now take for granted in our daily lives. From what we're taught in traditional history, we've always believed the world was like a patchwork quilt, a collection of separate states and empires, constantly at odds with each other, locked in endless conflicts and wars. But the new chronology says that wasn't always the case. So, I have a question, perhaps more from a psychological point of view. While working with the new chronology, when did it first become clear to you that there really once was such a thing as a unified empire, covering almost the entire planet and all its inhabited lands? How difficult was it for you personally, as a real, living person, to accept this idea? Which parts of your research, which pieces of evidence, finally convinced you to accept the idea of this unified empire?
It's a very natural question, and many readers of our books ask it too. About myself and my colleagues, Gleb Nosovsky and Tatiana Fomenko, I can say this. The new chronology is based on new methods for analyzing historical sources. And only thanks to these methods, grounded in statistics, mathematics, and astronomy, were we able to rebuild the real timeline of ancient history. This is the foundation of the new chronology, and it's something anyone can verify for themselves. These are mathematical results. But once we did this, the consequences followed naturally. I remember very well how shocking and astonishing they were for us too. For example, our methods showed that many ancient eras are actually duplicates of later periods, specifically from the 13th to the 17th centuries AD. We found that the famous empires of the ancient world, the Roman Empire of Julius Caesar, the Roman Empire under Diocletian, the Roman Kingdom of Romulus and Remus, the Caliphate, the Celestial Empire of China, and so on, all turn out to be reflections of one enormous empire that actually existed across Eurasia and the Americas from the 13th to the 17th centuries AD.
So, at the heart of this conclusion lies hard mathematical calculation, numbers and formal logic, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Without mathematics, astronomy, and statistics, it would of course be impossible to put forward such reconstructions. And when we realized this, I remember very well that it was a huge shock for us. It goes completely against everything we've been accustomed to since childhood. We're used to thinking in terms of countless kingdoms and a patchwork quilt of states, in politics, culture, warfare, and languages. But it turned out that all these developments are actually quite recent. All of this really took shape and gained strength starting from the late 17th and 18th centuries. Before that, the picture was completely different. This realization did not come easily to us. Of course, it's a reconstruction, it's not a mathematical theorem. But it's backed by a vast amount of material and is grounded in a mathematically verified chronology. We believe this is a significant discovery that overturns many of our ideas not only about ancient events, but also about what happened in the 17th, 18th, and even 19th centuries. Naturally, we did not reach this conclusion at the very beginning of our research. It was the result of the reconstruction process. I repeat, for us, and, as I understand it, for many of our readers, this conclusion is not easy to accept. It requires understanding and discussion. It goes against many of our deeply ingrained assumptions. I hope we can talk about this in more detail during our presentation.
Anatoly Timofeyevich, if we look at disciplines that have nothing to do with the new chronology, and, moreover, that emerged many decades before it, such as comparative linguistics, comparative religious studies, and comparative cultural studies, we see that, in essence, they all claim the same thing. All the phenomena we're discussing now, languages, culture, politics, folklore, and even confessions, for that matter, fundamentally trace back to a single source. First, languages, cultures, and religions are all deeply and closely related to each other. And second, if I'm not mistaken, this conclusion was first drawn primarily by German scholars back in the second half of the 19th century, that there once was a single source. It's just that scholars at the time placed that source somewhere far back in remote antiquity, somewhere before the Common Era, before Christ. In fact, we could probably say that there is no fundamental difference or contradiction between this part of the findings of traditional disciplines and the new chronology. The only difference is that traditional history and the conventional sciences place this era of unity in an unimaginably distant past, when we talk about tribes or tribal unions. The new chronology, on the contrary, asserts that these were realities of what is, by historical standards, a very recent time. Just 400 years ago, the world looked completely different. Do you think it's fair to draw that conclusion?
Absolutely, one can. Indeed, modern scholarship still preserves many traces showing that at the foundation of our civilization, culture, history, military affairs, and linguistic unity, there was some common entity, which we conventionally call the Great Horde Empire of the 13th-17th centuries. Scholars from different disciplines, at different times and for different reasons, have noticed these facts. But because they were constrained by the erroneous Scaliger-Petavius chronology, they couldn't see any explanation for this phenomenon in an era relatively close to our own. So, they were forced to place all these facts, parallels, and duplicates they discovered, deep into the distant past. As a result, a kind of phantom or mirage appeared in history, something they began to study, believing they were studying a real phenomenon. But that is a mistake. The effect of a global cultural, linguistic, and civilizational commonality does exist, but it should be dated to the period from the 13th to the 17th centuries, relatively close to us. This is one of the radical implications of the new chronology.
Perhaps, to conclude our brief conversation, one more question, this one closer to modern politics. Many critics, and even some cautious supporters of the new chronology, often react somewhat sensitively to the fact that the center of the unified empire turns out to be Moscow. Or, more precisely, the region that today corresponds to modern Russia. Yaroslavl, Suzdal, Pereslavl-Zaleski, Moscow itself, and naturally, Istanbul. This naturally gives rise to various discussions and assumptions about the author's supposed bias. Please tell us, when did you first come to understand and realize that the ancient empire had a dual center? That there were in fact two pillars, today's Istanbul, Constantinople, and Moscow? What were the decisive arguments that helped you clearly pinpoint this geographical location? I'd like to stress to our viewers, and I emphasize this, that this is, first and foremost, a geographical reference, not a political one. When it comes to the realities of the 15th-16th centuries, it is simply impossible and incorrect to speak in modern terms like Russian or Russia. These were different phenomena, different realities.
The conclusion is that the empire's metropolis was, in a sense, dual, and that there were two wings of the same empire. One wing was the Vladimir Suzdal Russia, and the other was Istanbul, or, more precisely, Jerusalem, that is, Tsargrad, ancient Troy. These are all different names for the same center. This conclusion was reached, once again, through the analysis of chronology, on the basis of the global chronological map that we created using our methods for dating old sources. After we discovered that vast blocks of ancient history rise from the depths of the past into the Middle Ages, it turned out that the metropolises of these empires, which were previously thought to be scattered geographically, overlap with these two geographic centers: the Vladimir Suzdal Russia and the territory of Tsargrad Istanbul. This conclusion is based on research that we believe can be verified through the analysis of texts using statistics, mathematics, and astronomy.
Moreover, to be honest, the phenomenon of a giant Eurasian empire is not actually denied by traditional scholarship either. It's simply called the Mongol Empire. Its source is placed somewhere in the barren, remote, harsh, and arid expanses of Central Asia, which, as we know, still have one of the lowest population densities in the world, since the living conditions there are extremely unfavorable for humans. Accordingly, its political center is sometimes described as the Volga region, sometimes Central Asia, or somewhere else entirely. So, in essence, the new chronology is not saying something radically new here. In other words, the new chronology does not introduce aliens or any other completely fantastical entities. It simply offers a different reading of material that, even without the new chronology, already holds a prominent place in history textbooks.
Exactly. You mentioned that some people sometimes react rather sensitively to the identification of various empires that arises in the new chronology. This really does happen. For some reason, many people interested in history are very fond of the Roman Empire, the Celestial Empire of China, the Caliphate, or the Mongol Empire. But when they hear about our research, which says that all these were indeed real entities but are actually phantom reflections of a single empire, many of our opponents for some reason react with mild irritation. We don't quite understand this, because we believe that what we offer, as a reconstruction or as a hypothesis, unites large blocks of ancient history and fills out the period from the 13th to the 17th centuries. We begin to see history as richer, fuller, and more vivid.
More than that, it becomes more natural, more harmonious, without strange empty gaps.
Yes, and in our view, the disappearance of the so-called Dark Ages is a natural conclusion of our research, which, psychologically, should be quite understandable to modern people. So, in reality, even from a psychological perspective, we don't see any major obstacles to people accepting our findings.
In other words, it's really just about habit. It's simply more familiar to talk and think about ancient Romans or Arabs, isn't it?
Yes, habit. Unfortunately, habit has a huge influence on all of us. Habit guides many of our actions and thoughts, and that's something we have to accept.
Anatoly Timofeyevich, thank you very much. Dear friends, we will be talking about all this, and much more, at our meeting with Academician Fomenko as part of the Sphere project. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.